if we're working in a different culture, we have to respect the language and the culture around us. And children live in a really different culture to the one that you and I live in as adults. They live in the culture of childhood. And that has its own distinct language, rules, values, communication patterns, space. Everything's different. So I think if we are going to really respect our clients and respect children, we need to be able to relearn that language of play in all its nuances and be prepared to be able to engage and work within that language.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Ever thought about what play therapy is all about? Well, in today's podcast, I speak with Jacki Short, who's the director of the Sydney Centre for Creative Change. Jacki and I talk about what's play therapy, what's it like to work with young people therapeutically, and I suppose the differences that are there as opposed to working with adults. You'll see me grappling with the concept. It takes me a little while to pick up on it because it's kind of hard to pull it away from what it's like working with adults. So Jacki does an exceptional job in talking about working with young persons and how therapy and play assists in going out and allowing them to express themselves and find greater safety and security, find out more about themselves and develop stronger bonds with not only the clinician, but also with others close to them. I think you're going to find a lot of value out of this one.
Welcome, Jacki, to the podcast. It's great to have you, talking about play therapy, your work in that space, being a psychologist, and also the workshops and, seminars that you do. So, thanks for coming along today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Nesh. It's great to see a growing interest in the field of creative therapies, particularly play therapy in Australia.
Absolutely. Look, I actually have to admit that I know very little, and hence why I reached out to find out more about this space, because I work with adults, I work with couples. The sort of younger age group is not someone I work with. Is not sort of the age group I work with, but I'm fascinated to find out more about this space, because I know that here in my practice we do offer child and adolescent sort of work, and we've got the provision to assist young persons, but from a play therapist perspective and someone who's willing to come onto the show with your experience, I think it's fantastic to hear your voice.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. It is really great to be here and talk about it, because I think many of us in our profession are interested in children, are interested in supporting young people, and it's not something that we really get a lot of training in or much understanding around. And I think most of the clinical skills that we pick up in our various degrees and qualifications equip us reasonably well for working with adults and possibly with adolescents, but not at all for working with children. So I think when we are committed to really making a difference for our younger clients, we really do need some additional training and support and understanding of developmentally appropriate ways and evidence-based ways of engaging with and also supporting therapeutically young people to help make changes that they need to make too.
Yeah, I don't recall at any stage doing any training at a university level in working with young the children's sort of space, and certainly not play therapy. I'm not sure. Did you come across that at all for yourself?
Zero amount of training in working with children. I did developmental psychology. It was the only subject I got a HD in, which I was very excited about. So I think that sort of was part of my trajectory in that direction, determining that. But I was always interested in children and working with children, but really had no practical training in it. So it wasn't until I left and started working in the field that I gained some wonderful supervision, some excellent training, and lots of experience. So I think
it was only Piaget's work. My apologies. I think it was only Piaget's work that I recall, from probably a little bit more exposure than that, but certainly nothing that you could kind of say is, on a skills-based training level to go out and look at the efficacy and the evidence base behind working with young persons.
Yeah, that's really true. And certainly the psychologists who come to do the courses with us currently also complain that even after getting a PhD in the field and working for many years at a university level, they come out with not a lot of really skill-based training. And I think it's something that is required in the industry once we actually get started. So it is that, that face-to-face stuff I think that we need to really grow our capacity to be able to work well in this space.
Yeah, how did you get involved in the, whether it be in the play therapy or working with young persons space? How did that all come about?
When I left university, my very first job was a research position in a hospital, Parramatta Hospital. I was working in the drug and alcohol unit, and it was all the age of smoking cessation. So it was sort of early to mid-80s, and there'd been a lot of legislative changes to make smoking in workplaces more challenging, and there was a lot more recognition of the health effects of smoking. So part of my job there was to run quit smoking groups for adolescents in schools as part of a research trial to see what was going to be effective and not. And it was the most unsuccessful clinical group I've ever run with adolescents because everyone was just starting to smoke. So nobody wanted to stop. It was just kind of not something that was popular at all. But what was popular was the fact that you could get out of English, maths or science and come along to our quit smoking group and just show everyone how tough you are because you're smoking. So in fact,
and have a cigarette after that.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe during, if you snuck out for that, just to go to the bathroom. So it was one of the most incredibly unsuccessful clinical experiences that I've had. But I learned a lot from that project. And what I learned was that change that we try and measure at face value is important. It's important to try and measure and assess what we're doing, but it's also really important to measure some of the unintended consequences of what we do. So while we had absolutely no effect in changing any of those young people's smoking rates who came along to our groups, what we did find in the experiment group that we're working in those 3 project schools, and it was thousands of students that we surveyed before and after our intervention group, compared to the control groups where we weren't running, which were matched in as many ways as we could, we actually had a preventative effect in those schools. So our very presence to run quit smoking groups meant that less young people took it up because they recognised it wasn't a great thing to be doing. So it always really reminds me that sometimes it's hard to really measure change in our industry. And when we only measure what we're setting out to achieve and we don't have a more general measure of some of the other things that could be happening around, we miss out on some of those more subtle changes. And I think when I'm working with children now clinically, one of the things that's very important for me to do is always establish and maintain relationships with those people who bring them in. So the parents and carers, referrers that are adults who've asked the child to come in for play therapy, to maintain a close relationship with them because they're noticing changes. So when I'm assessing for the effectiveness of what we're doing, I'm not only looking for change in the room with the child, and how they engage with the play materials, how they are in themselves and how they might be with me. But I'm critically speaking with parents and other adults to see what effect the changes that are happening here are happening in the real world.
It's really fascinating because I recall when Francis Mirabelli came for an APS meeting and was talking about this proposal of putting psychologists to the test, so to speak, where we could go out and try and demonstrate our value to, the community by, testing pre and post measures for what does a psychologist offer and how can that be demonstrated. And obviously that'll be a huge body of work about what do we measure, but there's a big question about what are we measuring, because at the moment most of us are probably just using a standard DAS, looking at depression, anxiety, stress sort of symptomatology within a week, versus something that might be a little bit more robust over time or kind of tell us a wider picture. So that's really fascinating that there was a preventative aspect, which that's a huge outcome. That's a really fantastic and successful outcome, but wasn't the targeted outcome, which is surprising.
Yeah. And we wouldn't have known that had we not done those bigger picture measurements, which was wonderful to do. I think that what that also reminds me of is the importance, whether we're doing studies at a university level in academia or whether we're doing real life research, to make sure that we always use mixed methods, so we have qualitative as well as quantitative data that we collect. And I think when we're working and trying to establish effectiveness in our own spaces, to be able to speak to the critical stakeholders in any sort of intervention and see what effect it's having on their lives and their experience, I think is pretty critical too. So I think for my purpose, that's why it's very important to maintain those relationships with the parents of children. But I sort of digressed a little bit from your original question, which was how I got started in the field. While I enjoyed doing the research and it was great getting those positive outcomes, not necessarily in the groups, but in the bigger communities that we were working in, I realised what I loved most was actually doing that face-to-face work, and ended up working in schools, doing school counselling for about 14 years of a variety of schools, primary and high schools, Catholic and private schools. And then more recently, in the last 15 years, I've been working in private practice. So I really, really love working with children and teenagers and families, although now I also do quite a lot of adult work as well. So I've got a fairly general practice, but most of what I'm currently doing, in addition to the practice, is doing the training work at Sydney Centre for Creative Change, and that's predominantly in play therapy, but it's also in a range of other creative and expressive modalities, which is really helpful, I think, for anybody, particularly children, but really anybody for whom talking isn't just working. I think we can just go round and round and repeat stories without really much effective change. I know myself, talking about things helps, but sometimes if something's particularly stuck, something in addition to talking can help. And I think this is how it is effective for children, because I don't think words are most children, particularly younger children's first language. I think the language that younger children tend to speak before they speak words, before they speak whatever native tongue they're raised in, is the language of play. And because it is children's natural language, it makes sense that we do therapy in that language. If you or I were zoomed up right now and landed in the middle of Italy, we wouldn't be doing therapy in English, we'd be doing therapy in Italian. So I think if we're working in a different culture, we have to respect the language and the culture around us. And children live in a really different culture to the one that you and I live in as adults. They live in the culture of childhood. And that has its own distinct language, rules, values, communication patterns, space. Everything's different. So I think if we are going to really respect our clients and respect children, we need to be able to relearn that language of play in all its nuances and be prepared to be able to engage and work within that language.
I think it's such a beautiful way to describe it, and that's something that really kind of attracted me to speaking with you as well, in reading your article in the APS, I think in the Insight magazine, where you spoke about that culture and how important that is. And it makes so much sense because, you know, adults and children are just so culturally different. We might live, you know, air quotes, in the same culture, same society, same community, but we've got very, very, very different cultures. You know, we're certainly at different developmental stages of our lives. We've got different responsibilities, as you say. We've got a completely different language. You know, one of play versus, you know, one of, you know, cognitive words and meaning and, you know, relational frames and, you know, a history of what all those things mean, the complexities, you know, very CBT sort of orientated versus that maybe that space of, as I say, creative and expressive, you know, spaces of play. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what does, you know, what is play therapy, you know, maybe in its basic form, and then we kind of maybe branch out to talk a little bit about how that might look, or maybe you can even offer us some different examples of what little parts might look like. I'm just fascinated to know what happens inside your sessions.
Thanks, Nesh, for your interest and all those great questions. I think play therapy is as broad an industry as counselling is. And I was teaching at a psychology college for about 17 years and taught methods of counselling. And we used to say that there's over 500 different methods of counselling. And I think while that might seem quite extreme and quite large, I think there are three broad categories that counselling modalities fall in. There's the psychodynamic initially, there's the humanist and existential, and then there's the more solution-focused and CBT approaches. And each of those has a different length of time of therapy Each of those has a peculiar pattern of relationship between therapist and client, and each of those has a different theory base and evidence for that would suggest different methods of interaction and different methods of engagement. And similarly, play therapy has its origins within the psychodynamic tradition. So Anna Freud, who was Sigmund's youngest daughter, really championed play therapy back 2 centuries ago. And there are still psychologists and other play therapists I know who work in Sydney from a psychodynamic play therapy perspective, and they work with young children for years doing psychodynamic play therapy. So that looks very different to someone more like me who's working from a humanist existential perspective, informed by what we would call child-led or non-directive approaches, which are more medium-term therapeutic interventions. And then there's very short-term solution-focused approaches, which look more at skill development or and are probably a bit better suited to older children or when there's a specific skill deficit that we're training for. So what play therapy looks like depends very much on the method that we're implementing of play therapy. So if I can tell you a little bit about the method that I feel most comfortable with, which is child-centred, it probably fits most neatly into a model that looks like a humanist, person-centred approach. So if you go back to Roger's videos with Gloria and Kathy back in the 70s and early 80s, you'll see him listening to and reflecting back what people are saying, not asking any questions, not leading, not labelling, not directing in any way. And in that process, through the relationship of care, of respect, of regard, of kindness, of genuine human connecting, that space of hearing and holding allows adults to be able to make sense of their own experience and to come to their own solutions and strategies. So that's the humanist perspective from an adult frame. And what we do in child-centred play therapy is exactly the same, but using toys, and we call tracking or reflecting back what children are doing and saying, so children get a more felt sense of who they are, what's important to them, and are able to take control of the things that are important for them. So it's kind of hard to sort of say it without actually seeing what it looks like, and to describe a little bit more what a room setup might look like for a younger child. They would come in, I would have had a session with a parent, at least 1 or 2 sessions with a parent, parents ideally, or carers, to find out from them what their concerns are, what their concerns are for their child, what else they've tried. We do a really thorough assessment. I determine whether play therapy is even suitable, because some parents are best supported by strategic help and support and parenting advice. Sometimes that's probably 50% of people I would see. I don't see children for counselling because it's the parents who can best do with that support. So, but if it is determined that it's useful for the child to come in for an assessment, the child comes in initially with the parent, and I explain to both what we're going to be doing today and show them the room. The parent then waits in the waiting room outside, and I would say to the child, in here you can say anything you'd like and you can do a lot of the things you'd like. And then I watch and wait to see how they engage with things, and I follow their lead entirely. So some children will immerse themselves immediately in play.
What age group would you say you'd start like that with?
For me, it's more about developmental age than chronological age.
Sure.
So if a child's experienced significant trauma or significant developmental delay or has special needs, then they might have the capacity to do this for longer. But generally, 2 to 10-year-olds, I find the most appropriate age to be doing this sort of work with.
Yeah, wow.
So, but some children, I can do it for much longer if they've got sort of delays in certain ways. So.
And so what would you then start to notice? I mean, obviously every presentation is so different, but would a child just sort of, pause and sit around for a little while, kind of look at whether they can, push the boundaries, can I get up and have a look? They'd probably potentially even ask, can I play with that or something? How does that space sort of look? I'm intrigued.
It's different for every child, it really is. And there's a variety of different ways that they might engage with the room, with the toys, with me, even just in themselves. It might depend on how they're feeling that particular day, but the theory of play therapy suggests that given a permissive and a supportive environment, children will play out, children will demonstrate through their play, literally or metaphorically, the things that are important and the things that are concerning for them. So they will play out in a way that we might talk out, the things that might be troubling us or the things that we might be wishing or hoping for. So it provides, the toys are the vehicle through which children can communicate what's important to them. So play therapy for me allows children in the most developmentally appropriate and sensitive way to express, to explore, and to resolve the challenges that they might be facing.
And what are the sorts of things that you'd be looking for? Because obviously there has to be a very trained eye, there has to be a very trained ear, someone who's trained in being able to kind of look at all those aspects of being in, I suppose, sitting alongside someone who's playing, and a little person, might begin to play with something. What are you listening for? What do you hear? What are you looking out for? What are you trying to kind of, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is what's going on in your mind while the young person's playing?
I guess I'm attempting to do a few things. So Gary Landreth, who's really championed in this century child-centred play therapy, argues that there's 4 healing messages that we communicate to children. And this also perhaps communicates my stance or what I'm attempting to do in this moment with a child. And one is to really hear the child, to listen very carefully and watch really carefully what they're doing, how they're playing, how they're interacting with me, what mood they might be in. So to listen and watch very carefully and to communicate that, hearing them through my verbal reflections and my response to their invitations to play. Also my capacity to set limits if they're doing things that are not safe. So to be able to be appropriately responsive comes from being able to hear them well. Communicating that I am here with them, very present in this moment. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not taking notes. I'm not checking my phone. I'm not talking to their parent. I'm just here with them. So this unconditional connection is an important healing capacity, I believe, too. So that's the second thing I'm trying to be very present to push out of my mind anything that could be a distraction. So I can just be totally present in this moment to be able to notice as much as I can. And the last 2 of the healing messages are to be able to hold and to communicate to the child that I care and that I understand. And through careful observation and careful reflection and tracking of what the child's doing, I'm communicating to them that they can make choices for themselves, that they can be appropriately and age-sensitively responsible for choices that they make and what they do. And while there's a lot of things that they can't control in their life, there's a lot of things that they actually can control. And I think that it's this permission giving and this allowing of that really helps children articulate what's important for them. And I guess that's a really big part of this work too.
Can you talk a little bit more about the things you would notice that might give you clues that you might want to, when I say clues, meaning they might give you leads that you might kind of want to follow up on or explore or give extra room? I'm not sure what the right language is, so I do apologise. I'm kind of fumbling around here.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I think that's a really perfect question from someone who works from a CBT and a language-based way with adults, to be completely honest, because what I work really hard to not do from a child-centred perspective is to lead. So I get ideas of what's important for the child, but I'm not following up on those with a question or with a challenge or with a suggestion or with an invitation, because I want to follow the lead of the child. And one of the reasons that I critically don't do that, so a child might be playing out in a somewhat aggressive manner. They might be bashing something, and they're doing it in a way that's not going to hurt the thing that they're bashing, but they're expressing some anger. So what I'm doing is reflecting. I can see that makes you really mad in an appropriately matched tone of voice. So what I'm doing is let the child know that I see what their experience is. And in that, they're encouraged to talk about that more, to share that more, to show that more if they want to. And if they don't, then I'm not pursuing it any further. I think one of the challenges in working with children is being able to recognise and respect that their window of tolerance is much smaller than ours. So what can happen when children start playing out things that are the presenting issue? I can go, oh, great, now they've finally got onto it. Tell me more about that. And what that does potentially is re-traumatise children. So when we ask questions, when we lead, when we direct processes, particularly for children who've experienced really challenging situations, what I can do is hold them in a space that they can't tolerate, and then they don't want to come back. 99% of children that I see for play therapy love coming and want to come back. 99% of clinicians that I talk to or work with or train who don't use play therapy have children who do not want to come and who often don't come back. So I think it's such an engaging way of working with children, not only because it's fun for them, it is respectful of their language and uses their language to communicate and to resolve issues, but critically it's respectful of their pace and of their tolerance of challenge. So I think as adults, we have 1,000 ways of coping with difficult things. We can compartmentalize, we can distract ourselves, we can talk ourselves through it. Kids don't have that capacity. And as soon as they start remembering or revisiting something, if they don't have strategies to manage, they get overwhelmed and we make it worse rather than better. So one of the particular benefits for me in working with very fragile children sometimes, or children who've experienced really terrible experiences, is that this is the most respectful way that I could ever work. And that's why I really love it too.
It feels, and I don't know if I'm interpreting probably only an aspect of what you've said and what you're trying to convey, but it almost feels like when you're sitting alongside the young person or child, you're in some sense helping put words to some of the things that they're doing, not in a leading way, but just in an observational way.
Absolutely. Yep, that's exactly right, Nesh.
It might be kind of just narrating as you would if you were highly curious, and you know, it might be that it might be appropriate at some point to say, if there's a doll involved, for example, you know, riding on a dinosaur, you know, you might be asking, I wonder where they're going, or something like that. And then the young person would, you know, come up with whatever that their next imaginative thing might be. Am I kind of capturing some of this?
Definitely getting closer. So again, I don't ask questions.
Okay.
So what I would do
be asking questions. Okay.
I wouldn't even say where they're going. What I would do is I would notice that, and I wouldn't even call it the girl on the dinosaur, because I don't know if this is a dinosaur and this is a girl. This could be mummy in her new car, or this could be me on my broomstick, or it could be anything. So I'm very careful not to label anything that the child is doing or is picked up or is playing with until the child has. So I would just refer to those things as this or that until such time as the child's named it. So let's say the child has said, yes, I'm getting on my dinosaur. And so they've named it. So I'm going to say, oh, you're on the dinosaur. And then I wait. Because if she wants to tell me more about that, she will. But if I say, where are you going, then I'm leading that. It's very subtle. Every time I ask a question, it's a lead. So I'm not leading at all. I'm just noticing. And then if she wants to talk, and if I'm engaged and interested, she's much more likely to want to tell me anyway. But she makes that choice when, if, and how she's ready to. So she might abandon that at that point, and then she might become the girl on the dinosaur going into the future, and she might dress up as that and embody it. So she can choose the way she expresses it. She can talk about it. She can play it out. She can dress up as it. She can sing it. She can do what's right for her. It's her language. It's her form of expression she's choosing. So that's why I avoid asking questions.
No, that makes much more sense. So the narrative is okay, so long as we're not placing judgment or a form of it, because we don't know what their imagination is holding that as in their form, and we could at that point actually sway them, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to actually just sit with them, and so, you know, the object becomes, you know, it or they, until there's a decision from the young person as to what that is. And at that point, obviously, it would be natural to reflect back that that's what that is, because you've adopted and accepted their position.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And then in some sense, you just wait patiently for wherever their imagination goes next.
Yeah. And the more I wait and the more I genuinely believe that their story will emerge if and when they're ready to, the more they feel trusting of themselves and the more they have control over this story. And I think as adults working with children, we're very well-meaning and we want to protect children, we want to look after children, but sometimes we end up doing for children things that they can do for themselves. So if a child is really struggling with something, in 90% of situations in my life, I'm likely to go over and offer help or, ask if they want some assistance or do something for them. But in play therapy, I wouldn't. So I'd let them struggle as long as they possibly could so they can figure out how to do it for themselves. And children genuinely value that opportunity to really learn and develop at their own pace and in their own way. And play therapy, this form of play therapy really allows that too. As I said, this is just one of many forms of play therapy. But it's in some ways it's the most challenging to learn because it really means me redefining what my relationship to helping is, my relationship to relating to children, and most critically my relationship to leading children, which is what productively we need to do as adults in our community. We need to be able to lead children. We need responsible, kind of adapted children who put on their shoes in the morning and eat their breakfast and go to school and come home and do their homework and get on with their brothers and sisters and all those things we need to help teach and train and guide and lead toward. But therapeutically, if our goal is to allow children to express in their own language at their own time, at their own pace, then the less questions that I ask, the less I lead and the less I label, the more effective I'll be and the more children want to come back.
This is going to be quite naive because obviously I'm still trying to work my old paradigm across to your paradigm. Would it be accurate to say you'd spend most of the session with the young person in that explorative play and allowing them to feel comfortable and doing skill development, mastery, acquisition, imaginative play, talking about whatever it is they want to talk about, playing in whatever tickles their fancy on that particular day, and you, I suppose, assist them through being curious, so they're giving them permission to do all those things, and I'm assuming they also want to engage with you because people in play often want to play with others. How much would you be playing? I mean, sorry, my apologies, I've asked two questions. How long would that be going on for? The assumption of the whole time. Please let me know what that is. And secondly, how engaged would you be if you're asked to get involved? Are you still getting involved fully and completely as you would with your own children? Having a play, but still just maintaining those boundaries around not going out and labeling, placing attributes to things that you're not aware may or may not be there for the young person.
Two great questions. So to answer your first one about how long, the length of time of the session depends on the age and the maturity level of the child. So younger children I might only see for half an hour. Older children I would see for 45 or 50 minutes. If a family has travelled a distance and there's a couple of siblings, I would tend to see them all together to start with, just to let everyone know what we're all doing and what's going to happen today. And then I would see the children one at a time, maybe for 20 or 30 minutes each, again, depending on what we've arranged. In terms of duration, it's like any length of time of counselling. It might be a short or a medium time. I tend not to see children for very long periods of time, but I would certainly want to see them usually for a couple of months, depending on what the presenting issue is. If it's something quite serious and long-standing, clearly the therapy is going to take longer too. So it depends a little bit on that. If I'm working from a child-centred perspective exclusively, and this is all I'm doing, this is all I'm doing. So it doesn't sound like much, but incredibly it's powerful, and I think it is still the most effective and powerful way of working with younger children. If I'm trying to teach a skill, then I can do that in a much more structured and directed way. But it's my agenda or it's some adult's agenda that someone has deemed this useful for this child. And it might be, but it might not be. So even those of us who are really close to kids and really get kids never ever know fully what another person's experience has been. So it's not until I'm really kind of in a relationship that's trusting and caring enough that the other person is going to feel safe to share and to explore and to resolve those issues. So if I ask questions, if I direct too much, if I lead, then I deny that child the opportunity to feel safe enough to be able to really show me what's right for them. So there are plenty of other ways to work, and many of us who work as play therapists in Australia, and in fact internationally, I've got colleagues all over the world who do play therapy work, can work eclectically. So they might use this child-led or non-directive approach as an assessment window, as a way of building engagement and rapport, and then start to work a little bit more strategically or in a more directed way. But I always use the example of, if I'm trying to teach children about emotions and I have a chart on the board, or I have a whiteboard and I draw faces and I say, this is angry, or this is, this is what angry looks like. Let's do angry. And we pull the face and we talk about a time we might have felt angry, or we play a game. We can roll a dice, and every time it lands on 3, we have to talk about a time we felt angry. We've got lots of strategic games like that we can play, which is certainly more engaging for children and older kids, teenagers, than just talking about it. But it's still quite strategic and directed, those sort of activity-based play strategies in therapy. If through feeling frustrated with something, and it might be that they're having a really good time and they don't want to go and the time's up, and I've given them a time warning and we're getting close to the time, and I say to the child, our time's nearly up for today, I'll see you next week, and they say, I don't want to go, and they get really angry. They're really angry right now. And what I can do in the moment is do some limit setting with them and work in the context of their emotion in the room. The benefit of child-led play allows real emotions to come up in real time and allows me to see, to notice, and to manage them in real time. And I think that's a much better skill opportunity for development than doing it hypothetically. Let's make a face and remember a time. Because children are so living in the now that getting them to imagine anything else is not real for them. So it just makes sense, again, in terms of that culture of childhood and their perception and relationship with time, to work in real time, which is why I prefer to do child-centred play.
It makes much more sense to me, that, because I've always thought about, and this isn't mine, but I can't remember who said it, where part of the role of a parent or a caregiver is to help children with packaging their emotions and feelings and just sorting them out, because they're not sure how to do so well. But it kind of has to happen in real time, because we're packaging them when they're feeling them, not packaging them, in theory. And we all know, even working with adults, working with theory just doesn't cut it. You've got to get, those emotions and feelings and that experience in the room to be doing the heavy lifting. And so I'm in full appreciation and understanding as to why that would be the way to go. At least I think it's wise and makes lots of sense. What would you be hoping to? And you can see I'm kind of still wrestling in this space. What would you be hoping to see with a child? And maybe you can offer a case that you can recall. Obviously, we'll always speak in a confidential way, protecting everyone. But what would you hope to see? What would be the things that you would like to see from a young person coming in with, let's say 1 or 2, caregivers who are there who present with X, and maybe I'll let you kind of decide whether it's anxiety, depression, there was a trauma, there's been a separation in the families, whatever the matter is. What would you hope to see over a course of, whether it be a couple of months, a few months, however you kind of assess what would be most appropriate for that young person?
Very simply, I would hope for positive change. And I think that really looks different for every child and every family. I think what I'm always hoping for is a greater understanding and respect among everybody. So now I work in private practice, all parents who come and see me are really genuinely interested in and wanting the best for their kids. And sometimes they just don't understand what their experience has been, because they might be in a difficult emotional situation too. So I get many parents who are no longer living together, they've experienced a divorce or separation, and they're concerned about their child. The child might be behaving badly at school, they might be getting into trouble, they might be sad or withdrawn, but definitely the child has had some emotional response to and reaction to the parent separation. So what I want to be able to do is to hear from both parents, and it might be that they're not able to sit in a room together, so I'll have 2 separate sessions or speak with them on the phone to get a full picture from both of them about what their concerns are, and then to work with the child or young person in a way that's most developmentally appropriate, to allow them to, in their own language, in their own time, express what their concerns are, and to figure out what they need to do to manage this, because this is not, as much as they might like their parents to get back together, that's not going to happen in most situations. So what can they do to manage this better? I can give them a list of 20 coping strategies, which may or may not work. And I might work in that slightly more directive way with older kids. But with younger children, it's really helping them in the moment of play and through different creative forms of expression, helping them realise through noticing curiously and reflecting what they're doing, what they get pleasure out of. So to give them a sense that while their world is no longer kind of as it was and it's challenging for them, there's still things that they can feel good about and can do for themselves. So part of finding coping strategies is actually, again, in real time, figuring out things that you particularly like to play with maybe, and maybe things that you really don't want in your world, but to be able to kind of manage these things through metaphor, through play, to be able to better cope with what's happening. So what I would want is I would want an indication from parents or teachers about specifically what their concerns are at the outset. And at the finish of treatment, I would like to be able to hear from them that those things that were concerning them are concerning them less or have gone for the child. And that child is happier and more content in themselves, given a difficult situation that might have happened. So that would be success for me.
In some sense, it's almost like when working with adults, there can be kind of this big question mark for adults themselves, particularly those who are kind of scratching their heads and going, what could a psychologist offer? There's the understanding among psychologists that talking about one's challenge, difficulty, with someone who's highly curious, is non-judgmental, is client-centered, and allows that person to appreciate and understand their situation, from whatever perspective. And they might stretch their thoughts or inquire a little bit more with an adult than you may with a young person. But through doing that, there can be a sense of better understanding and appreciation of the situation, or even sometimes a greater confidence in oneself through that. And through that, it's difficult to go out and measure, has this person gone out and done something measurably different, but they can certainly feel a lot better within themselves, which, can obviously have lots of positive improvements across the board. And in some sense, the language, going back to what we were discussing at the start, the language of a child is play. And if we can allow children to play in their most genuine, free, safe, encouraged and nurtured way, they themselves will get something potentially something like similar to what an adult would get, but slightly different culture there. One being of play and the other one being of talking about, their challenges. Am I getting closer?
Yeah, I think you're really getting close now. And I love the words you use: genuine, safe, free, caring, nurtured. That's exactly what it is. And play therapy is not just play. I think from the outside, it looks like children are just playing, but the skills that a play therapist uses are not the same skills that you would use with most children in most situations. In fact, it takes a really long time to learn it. I do an introduction 2-day workshop, which is just an introduction to the theory, to the evidence, and to the skills. So we do lots of role plays, we practice it, I demonstrate it, I show videos. It's a real doing workshop. but it's just the beginning. People take months and years to really perfect this particular approach to play therapy. It's not just play. Even though the toys might look similar, they're carefully chosen to allow children to be able to express frustration, to be able to express curiosity, to be able to tell fantasy-based stories, real-life stories. So it's purposeful play for therapeutic gain. And I think what's really critical is the relationship. And you've mentioned how critical that is with adult therapy as well. It's those core conditions of unconditional positive regard, respect and congruence that really form the foundation for this sort of play therapy approach too. And your earlier question about do I play or to what extent do I get involved, I think comes in here too and is very much led by the child. So I've had children who will come in and they're quite happy to play by themselves, that interact with the toys, that tell stories. Sometimes the stories sound exactly like what their parent has said the issue might have been. So there's a direct kind of corresponding map and there's a translation that's pretty clear. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle and it's working at a deeper metaphoric level. I don't play with children unless and until I'm invited into play. And at that moment of the invitation, I say yes. So a child might say, we're going to play with these and you can be the monkey and I'm going to be the penguins and we're going to go to the park. So I'm the monkey and I'm ready to go. So as soon as I'm handed a toy, as soon as I'm given an offer to join, I say yes and I join. But I don't join in until such time as I've been invited because that would be leading. So I don't sit on the floor and say, let's play with the penguins because that's my story rather than listening for theirs. So again, it's a really, really child-led approach.
Yeah. What sort of questions would mum, dad, caregiver, loved one ask at the end of a session, and how would you sort of discuss and review, debrief, and obviously, and maybe you can also share what you might speak about with another colleague, another psychologist, versus what you might speak with a, parent in terms of, part of maybe your formulation or what your thoughts are versus how you might kind of assist the parent in seeing, their particular situation scenario, their young person, how they can support them best.
One of the things that's really important for me to do before I see children in my initial sessions with the parents and getting the assessment down is being really clear about how I'm going to be communicating with them and when I'm going to be touching base. So I want to stay in close contact with the parents, with the people who've brought their children in, but I don't want to do it at the end of the session. And the reason I don't want to do it straight at the end of the session is that I've just had this magic moments with this child. We've engaged, they felt safe and comfortable. So I don't want to then put them in the waiting room and get their parent in and spend an hour with their parent, because that would completely undo any of that safety I've just built up. So what I say to the parents, after the first session, I invite them in and we have a quick chat in the room, and I would say, it's been great working with your son or daughter today, and this would be a very typical first session. We've got to know each other a bit and we've had a bit of a play. And that's all I would say to the parent in front of the child. But the child hears me say that. And then I would contact the parent as we had arranged. So depending on what the presentation is, how anxious a parent might be, I might phone them that night, I might email them. We'd have another follow-up meeting after a couple of sessions. I get their feedback, their perception of what's happening, and then I give them feedback around the themes of play and anything that I'm concerned about that I think they can help strategically with. So I would give some support and advice at that point, but not straight after the session.
Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely. Because in actual fact, that's what's so inviting to the young person, and hence why they want to come back. And in actual fact, to go out and interrupt that, break that. And, it's going to be uncomfortable being in a strange waiting area without your, parent, and that's not going to be safe whatsoever. They need to safely go from parent to the, to the therapist, and then back to the parent or caregiver, and so they're in safe hands the whole time. And that makes exactly lots of sense.
To tell you a small de-identified story, I was seeing a mother a couple of months ago with 3 sons, and they'd all been victims of domestic violence, and Dad was long gone from the picture. And she was concerned about some of the lasting effect that it had on these boys' behaviour at school. They were starting to play out some of this a little bit, and she brought the 3 of them in, and the youngest was 3, the next one was about 6, and the older one was about 9. And they all came in together, and I had a meeting and told them a little bit about what I did. Mum had told me in a very truncated way in front of the children about why they were there, so they were really clear what I knew, what she was bringing them for. She didn't go into the depth that she went into it in that assessment period that I had with her prior to the children being there. Kids don't need to hear all of the nasty stuff all over again, but just a summary of that was enough. And then I said, who'd like to come first? I'm going to see you each for about 15 minutes today. And the younger one had already started playing, so spent some time with him, and then after 20 minutes he went outside, and then the older one sort of came in, and the middle one was not so sure. And when I came out of that second session with the older child, he was hiding behind the lounge in the waiting room, and he said to his mum, I don't want to go with her, I don't want to talk about it all. And the older one leaned over, and in a whisper that is never a whisper because children whisper so loudly, it's okay, she doesn't even ask any questions about Dad. And then he looked up and he said, okay, I'll come in. So he came in and played out what was of concern to him, but he wouldn't have been able to do that if I'd asked him 1,000 questions. So I think kids really respond to the ability to be able to use a language that's comfortable for them, and to only talk about, to only share, to only play out what they want to. I think we somehow force that. Children are always reluctant clients. Children are never ringing me saying, are you free at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon? I'm 5 and I've got my mum's credit card. Yeah, of course they're referred from others. They're reluctant clients. So until we can engage them, we actually can't do any therapy work. And if we don't engage them, then we don't do therapy work. Maybe it's not their time. Just because everyone thinks it's a good idea to have therapy. If we spoke to each other's next of kin, I'm sure they'd tell the other of us all sorts of things that we should be working on in our own therapy, but it might not be what we choose right now to do. And I think we have to respect children as much as we respect adults in not forcing that they talk about certain things at certain times and in certain ways.
And I imagine kids just simply cannot articulate what's important for them to express, to try and appreciate, to try and understand. They're battling with enough, or not cognizant of how to even go out and sort out what needs to be sorted out. They're incredibly resilient and they'll get through, but they need some gentle, compassionate hands to be able to do that with very specifically. Do you ever train, and just out of curiosity, we're not trying to say train, my apologies, do you ever share this narrative play, assisting in sort of following the journey with the young person, with parents to try and engage with their kids in that way, at least for periods, where obviously mums and dads can't do that all day, every day, not by any means. And obviously there's a hell of a lot of training that goes with it. But is that something that you might discuss with some parents, to take 20 minutes out to be at the young person's level, and to just engage with immense curiosity, being sort of child-led for periods of time, so there is that safe place with the parent too?
I think it's a really beautiful way of supporting parents to build and to deepen relationships with their children. And as you say, it's not a parenting strategy. It's not something that you would want parents to be doing all the time, to be just letting children lead. Parents have a very responsible job to educate and support and to feed, clothe and to nurture children in many ways. But I think this is a really powerful way of letting the child know that they're deeply loved and cared for, and they can sometimes make decisions and choices for themselves. They can't do everything they want to do, but they can do many things that they'd like to do. And as you're suggesting, even 20 minutes a week, I think can be really powerful. There's some great research coming out of the US to suggest that filial therapy, which is play therapy conducted by parents, has great outcomes for not only the relationship, but for also children's development. And some colleagues of mine, Sue Bratton and others, have run these trials in jails and have found that even when parents are separated from children, they can still have close and important and nurturing bonds when they communicate in ways that are respectful of and supportive of and allowing of the child to lead.
That's absolutely incredible, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit about the research and what it generally does try and look at? I know that in the article that I read, there was a study that I think almost looked like a meta-analysis that looked at 100 or so pieces of research around the globe, and looked at the, I suppose the efficacy or the value of doing play therapy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So back in 2005, Sue Bratton with her colleagues, Bratton, Ryan and Jones, did a meta-analytic review and found in the 50 years prior to that year, 93 different studies that had been done, controlled outcome studies at least, some of them were RCTs, that looked at the usefulness of play therapy with children. And what they found was that 80% of children did better after receiving play therapy than those that hadn't received play therapy. So it had a really, really high efficacy rate. They also found that play therapy that was child-led or non-directive yielded better outcomes than therapy that was directed or therapist-led. They also found that filial play therapy, so play therapy conducted by parents, had better outcomes than play therapy conducted by professionals trained in play therapy, which again shouldn't surprise us because parents have pre-existing and ongoing relationships with children, so they can access them a lot, and hopefully they've got that core relationship of care that can help with that too. So that's just one of many studies. There's been many more done since. Play therapy is a really established profession in North America, in South Africa, in parts of Europe, and growing in Australia, which is really great. So there's probably 5 peak bodies of play therapists in Australia at the moment. We have one master's program at Deakin University, and we have a range of certificate and postgraduate courses around Australia too. So there's plenty of ways that mental health professionals can get into the field, but it's really, really recommended to do further training in it and not just read a book and get some toys. So because it is such a specific and such an important area of work, further training is really highly recommended.
And I know that you offer some training, and obviously you've got an immense amount of experience. Can you tell us a little bit about the training that you do, where people can find you, what they can expect to see in your training as well? Because I know that there would be a lot of listeners out there who are psychologists or counsellors who want to be involved, and this is their space of passion. So I'm sure they're going to want to find out more details about that. So maybe, you can tell us a little bit about your sort of work.
Sure, Nesh. So I am the clinical director of Sydney Centre for Creative Change, and we run over 30 different short courses in creative therapies around Australia each year. Most of them are in Sydney, but we have some in Melbourne, in Hobart, in Brisbane, in Perth, and in Adelaide. So most of the centres around Australia host courses. Probably the most frequent one that we run is one that I do, which is art and play therapy. So it's a 2-day workshop that's skill-based, interactive and experiential. So you can expect to learn some theory about play therapy, some evidence for it, see demonstrations of it, and have a chance to do it in safe and supported ways. So always options to not do it, but lots of learning and lots of practical skill development. So it's one of a number of different courses that we run. We've got a drama therapy course coming up in Australia in a couple of weeks. In Sydney, we've got a creative mindfulness course coming up. So we have a variety of different workshops that we run for mental health professionals who work across the age span, but the art and play is specifically for working with children.
Lovely. And I see you've got some books behind you as well. Are there any specific books that you might say, are really good, starting blocks, if you will? Because I know there's going to be different sort of pitched at different levels. What would be a good starting sort of space, or a particular therapist or author? What would you say, it would be good for us to go out and explore ourselves as a intro?
There's 2 particular books that I highly recommend to everyone coming to my training, whether it's one of the webinars that we run or the 2-day course or even the certificate course in art and play therapy, which is a 200-hour course. The essential reading for that is Virginia Axline's book, DIBS, D-I-B-S. So that is written as a narrative. It's super easy to read, and it's a lovely illustration of a child-centred therapist's work with a little boy whose behaviour is atrocious. And after she works with him, we see the change. And it's just a lovely story. So Dibs, I highly recommend, Virginia Axline. Someone who was really influenced by Axline was Gary Landreth. And I also recommend his book. That's probably the Bible of child-centred play therapy around the world at the moment. One of the things that I love about this particular text is not just the title Play Therapy, it's the byline, The Art of the Relationship. So it's not about the art of the puppets or the art of the crayons. It's not about what toys you have in the room. The most important thing that we do when we work with children in play therapy is have a relationship.
Some of the work that Bruce Wampold wrote about as well, in terms of, you know, the therapeutic alliance, the connection between therapist and client. And I think, you know, we can kind of look at Rogers, we can look at Freud. You know, all the greats had a lot to say about that, and no surprises that, you know, the same occurs for children, if not, you know, more importantly, and hence probably why we see that it's even more powerful when parents can go out and learn some of these, I suppose, ways of being, you know, curious and being present and being non-judgmental and creating that really, really safe and genuine space for a young child to explore themselves, and in doing so, find out more about themselves and also develop an even richer relationship with, you know, those closest to them.
I think that's really true. If I can share a small story about that, I was seeing a father and son a couple of years ago who were having a lot of problems. Dad only, this is a slightly altered story to protect all parties, but Dad was had limited access because of a difficult family situation, and would see his son once every 2 weeks for a weekend. And his son was very resentful that he didn't get to see him more often, and it was often very conflictual, their time together. So they both came to see me, and I was doing some play therapy with the son, and the father wanted to understand more about what I was doing and wanted to learn some of these methods so he could relationship build with his 6-year-old son. And this little boy loved playing with my army figures, and he would set out, he would spend at least 15 minutes positioning all of these people in a particular way, and then we'd have a war and things would be destroyed, and it was really chaotic and very conflictual and very much his inner world. And Dad would come in halfway through the session and was watching me, and for the first couple of times he found it very difficult to just sit and watch, and he'd interrupt and say, "Oh, what about you get in this big tank?" And you could see the little boy bristle because it was his army and it was his battle, and he didn't want Dad to intrude. And I'd sort of give Dad a gentle look, and he'd go, "Oh, maybe not," and he'd sort of back off a little bit. And whenever Dad was in the room, it was he and I on one side, and we were battling Dad. And that's really what he felt like. So Dad was the enemy, Dad was the opposition, Dad was the one he was throwing bombs at. And after a period of time when Dad just started following his lead and tracking what he was doing and being with him rather than trying to tell him what to do and how to play, there was a shift one moment when he said, "Jackie, I think you'll be the opposition. I'm playing with Dad." And Dad went and sat next to him, and they fought against me. And it was just such a lovely moment of connection between his father and son when Dad was able to let go of his need to control and manage and tell him what to do and could just be with him. It was just a magic moment.
It's absolutely beautiful. I'll tell you what, I walked into our chat today knowing I can very easily say nothing, and I feel like I'm 20% there, you know, and I know there's probably a lot more for me to learn, but I feel like I've really got to appreciate a much deeper understanding of what play therapy is, what it can look like, and I know there's several different ways, but certainly in the child play led way, and it just sounds absolutely beautiful, and really appreciate you and your expertise in explaining it so well, because it's something that I mean, I still think I'm grappling with it, but it's starting to fit, and it just feels like it's absolutely right. So, appreciate your time with this. Can you tell us a little bit about how people can get in contact with you? Whether it be with your practice or whether it be with your training that you do.
Sure, Nesh. So I've got a website that's called Sydney Centre for Creative Change. And that has my contact details on the contact page. Any emails or inquiries come directly to me, so people can reach me that way. We've got a series of webinars that we have coming up this year, which are an introduction to different forms of play therapy. People can book in for those, or we've got a couple on demand as well. And if anyone's interested in any of the courses that we do, the information is on the website, and bookings can be made online on the site too. So, but any questions, feel free to be in contact.
We could speak for many, many hours, but I know that you're very busy, and you're being very, very generous with your time today. So thank you very, very much, Jacki, and appreciate sharing this, because I think many of us and I imagine parents as well with young ones would probably not consider play therapy as a viable option, because we don't know what it is, and I hope that this chat today helps to kind of break some of those ideas, because it certainly has for me, and I'm sure it will for others as well. So anyone out there listening, please reach out. I can comfortably say it sounds like it's incredibly grounded in that therapeutic, insightful space. It's really centered around a scientist practitioner model, and that speaks volumes. So, Jacki Short, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nesh. I appreciate you being able to come and talk about this topic that's just so close to my heart. So thank you for your interest and your inquiry and your really insightful questions, because I think that helps to make it easier to talk about too. So thank you very much.